One of the public relations triumphs of the 21st century was the rise of Barack Obama. His campaign slogan was, "Change we can believe in." He was a brand that offered something special, exciting. In 2008, Obama, the candidate, was voted Marketer of the Year, ahead of Apple, Nike, and Coors Beer. He made many people feel good, as if his slogan might be true. Above all, the perception of brand Obama was that he was against war.
Most of you know that I opposed this war from the start. I thought it was a tragic mistake.
But that was false. As president, Obama has not withdrawn America from Iraq and has backed US military action in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia and Yemen, and approved a military budget of $708 billion, the biggest war spending of all time. I'm delighted, especially to be here on the 4th of July. Which is an appropriate day to talk about Empire, Obama, and America's last taboo. I'm sorry the title's a bit wordy, but I couldn't get it down to something as it should be. Now, 2 years ago, I spoke at Socialism in Chicago about an invisible government, which was a term used by Edward Bernays, one of the founders of modern propaganda. It was Bernays who, in the 1920s, invented public relations as a euphemism for propaganda. And it was Bernays, deploying the ideas of his uncle, Sigmund Freud, who campaigned on behalf of the tobacco industry for women to take up smoking as an act of feminist liberation, calling cigarettes torches of freedom. At the same time, he was involved in the disinformation that was critical in overthrowing the Arbenz government in Guatemala. So you have the association there of cigarettes and regime change. The invisible government that Bernays had in mind brought together all media, PR, the press, broadcasting, advertising, and their power of branding and image-making, in other words, disinformation. And I suppose I'd like to talk today about this invisible government's most recent achievement, the rise of Barack Obama and the silencing of much of the left. But all of this has a history, of course, and I'd like to go back, take you back some 40 years to a sultry and, for me, very memorable day in Vietnam. I was a young war correspondent who had just arrived in a village in the Central Highlands called Tuy. My assignment was to write about a unit of US Marines who had been sent to the village to win hearts and minds. "My orders," said the Marine sergeant, "are to sell the American way of liberty as stated in the Pacification Handbook. This is designed to win the hearts and minds of folks as stated on page 86. Now, page 86 was headed in capital letters, WHAM, winning hearts and minds. The Marine unit was a combined action company, which, explained the sergeant, meant, and I quote, "We attack these folks on Mondays and we win their hearts and minds on Tuesdays," unquote. He was joking, of course, but not quite. The sergeant, who didn't speak Vietnamese, had arrived in the village, stood up in a jeep, and said through a bullhorn, "Come on out, everybody, we got rice and candies and toothbrushes to give you." This was greeted by silence. "Now listen, either you gooks come on out or we're going to come right in there and get you." Now the people of Tuy finally came out, and they stood in line to receive packets of Uncle Ben's Miracle Rice, Hershey bars, party balloons, and several thousand toothbrushes. 3 portable battery-operated yellow flush lavatories were held back for the arrival of the Colonel. And when the Colonel arrived that evening, the district chief was summoned and the yellow flush lavatories unveiled. The Colonel cleared his throat and took out a handwritten speech. "Mr. District Chief, and all you nice people," said the Colonel, "what these gifts represent is more than the sum of their parts. They carry the spirit of America." I promise you I'm quoting verbatim. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's no place on earth like America. It's the land where miracles happen. It's a guiding light for me and for you. In America, you see, we count ourselves as real lucky, as having the greatest democracy the world has ever known, and we want you nice people to share in our good fortune." Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, even John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill got a mention. All that was missing was the Star-Spangled Banner playing softly in the background. Of course, the villagers had no idea what the Colonel was talking about. But when the Marines clapped, they clapped. And when the Colonel waved, the children waved. And when he departed, the Colonel shook the sergeant's hands and said, "We've got plenty of hearts and minds here. Carry on, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." In Vietnam, I witnessed many scenes like that. I'd grown up in faraway Australia on a cinematic diet of John Wayne, Randolph Scott, Walt Disney and Ronald Reagan. The American way of liberty they portrayed might well have been lifted from the Wham handbook. I'd learned that the United States had won World War II on its own and now led the free world as the chosen society. It was only later when I read Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, a manual of the invisible government, that I began to understand the power of emotions attached to false ideas and bad histories on a grand scale. Now, historians call this exceptionalism, the notion that the United States has a divine right to bring what it calls liberty to the rest of humanity. Of course, this is a very old refrain. The French and British created and celebrated their own civilizing missions while imposing colonial regimes that denied basic civil liberties. However, the power of the American message was and remains different. Whereas the Europeans were proud imperialists, Americans are trained to deny their imperialism. As Mexico was conquered and the Marines sent to Nicaragua, American textbooks referred to an age of innocence. American motives were always well-meaning, moral, exceptional. As the Colonel said, there was no ideology, they said, and that's still the case. Americanism is an ideology that is unique because its main feature is its denial that it is an ideology. It's both conservative and it's liberal, and it's right and it's left. And Barack Obama is its embodiment. Since Obama was elected, leading liberals have talked about America returning to its true status as, and I quote, a nation of moral ideals. Those are the words of Paul Krugman, the liberal columnist of the New York Times. In the San Francisco Chronicle, columnist Mark Morford wrote, and I quote, "Spiritually advanced people regard the new president as a light worker who can help usher in a new way of being on the planet," unquote. Tell that to an Afghan child whose family has been blown away by Obama's bombs, or a Pakistani child whose house has been visited by one of Obama's drones, or a Palestinian child surveying the carnage in Gaza caused by American smart weapons, which, disclosed Seymour Hersh, were resupplied to Israel for use in the slaughter, and I quote, only after the Obama team let it be known it would not object. The man who stayed silent on Gaza is the man who now condemns Iran. In a sense, Obama is the myth that is America's last taboo. His most consistent theme was never change, it was power. The United States, he said, and I quote, leads the world in battling immediate evils and promoting the ultimate good. We must lead by building a 21st century military to ensure the security of our people and advance the security of all people. And there is this remarkable statement, and I quote, at moments of great peril in the past century, our leaders ensured that America, by deed and by example, led and lifted the world, that we stood and fought for the freedom sought by billions of people beyond our borders, unquote. Words like these remind me of the colonel in the village in Vietnam as he spun much the same nonsense. Since 1945, by deed and by example, to use Obama's words, America has overthrown 50 governments, including democracies, and crushed some 30 liberation movements and bombed countless men, women, and children to death. I'm grateful to Bill Blum for his cataloguing of that. And yet here is the 45th President of the United States having stacked his government with warmongers and corporate fraudsters and polluters from the Bush and Clinton eras, promising not only more of the same, but a whole new war in Pakistan, justified by the murderous cliches of Hillary Clinton, cliches like high-value targets. Within 3 days of his inauguration, Obama was ordering the death of people in faraway countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And yet, the peace movement, it seems, is prepared to look the other way and believe that the cool Obama will restore, as Krugman wrote, the nation of moral ideals. Not long ago, I visited the American Museum of History in the celebrated Smithsonian Institute in Washington. One of the most popular exhibitions was called The Price of Freedom, Americans at War. It was holiday time and lines of happy people, including many children, shuffled through a Santa's grotto of war and conquest, where messages about their nation's great mission were lit up. These included tributes to the, quote, and I quote, exceptional Americans who saved 1 million lives, unquote, in Vietnam, where they were, quote, determined to stop communist expansion, unquote. In Iraq, other brave Americans, quote, employed airstrikes of unprecedented precision, unquote. What was shocking was not so much the revisionism of 2 of the epic crimes of modern times, but the sheer scale of omission. Like all US presidents, Bush and Obama have very much in common. The wars of both presidents and the wars of Clinton and Reagan, Carter and Ford, Nixon and Kennedy are justified by the enduring myth of exceptional America. A myth the late Harold Pinter described as, and I quote, a brilliant, witty, highly successful act of hypnosis. The clever young man who recently made it to the White House is a very fine hypnotist, partly because it is indeed extraordinary to see an African American at the pinnacle of power in the land of slavery. However, this is the 21st century, and race, together with gender and even class, can be very seductive tools of propaganda. For what is so often overlooked and what matters, I believe, above all, is the class one serves. George Bush's inner circle, from the State Department to the Supreme Court, was perhaps the most multiracial in presidential history. It was PC par excellence. Think Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell. It was also the most reactionary. Obama's very presence in the White House appears to reaffirm the moral nation. He's a marketing dream. But like Calvin Klein or Benetton, he is a brand that promises something special, something exciting, almost risque, as if he might be radical, as if he might enact change. He makes people feel good. He's a postmodern man with no political baggage, and all that's fake. In his book, Dreams from My Father, Obama refers to the job he took after he graduated from Columbia in 1983. He describes his employer as, and I quote, a consulting house to multinational corporations, unquote. For some reason, he doesn't say who his employer was or what he did there. The employer was Business International Corporation, which has a long history of providing cover for the CIA with covert action and infiltrating unions on the left. I know this because it was especially active in my own country, Australia. Obama doesn't say what he did at Business International, and there may be absolutely nothing sinister, but it seems worthy of inquiry and debate as a clue to perhaps who the man is. During his brief period in the Senate, Obama voted to continue the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He voted for the Patriot Act. He refused to support a bill for single-payer health care. He supported the death penalty. As a presidential candidate, he received more corporate backing than John McCain. He promised to close Guantanamo as a priority, but instead he's excused torture, reinstated military commissions, kept the Bush Gulag intact, and opposed habeas corpus. Daniel Ellsberg, the great whistleblower, was right, I believe, when he said that under Bush a military coup had taken place in the United States, giving the Pentagon unprecedented powers. These powers have been reinforced by the presence of Robert Gates, a Bush family crony, and George W. Bush's powerful Secretary of Defense, and by all the Bush Pentagon officials and generals who have kept their jobs under Obama. In the middle of a recession, with millions of Americans losing their jobs and homes, Obama has increased the military budget. In Colombia, he is planning to spend $46 million on a new military base that will support a regime backed by death squads and further the tragic history of Washington's intervention in that region. In a pseudo event in Prague, Obama promised a world without nuclear weapons to a global audience mostly unaware that America is building new tactical nuclear weapons designed to blur the distinction between nuclear and conventional war. Like George Bush, he used the absurdity of Europe threatened by Iran to justify building a missile system aimed at Russia and China. In another pseudo-event at the Annapolis Naval Academy, decked with flags and uniforms, Obama lied that America had gone to Iraq to bring freedom to that country. He announced that the troops were coming home. This was another deception. The head of the Army, General George Casey, says with some authority that America will be in Iraq for up to a decade. Other generals say 15 years. Chris Hedges, the very fine author of Empire of Illusion, puts it very well. President Obama, he wrote, does one thing, and brand Obama gets you to believe another. This is the essence of successful advertising. You buy or do what the advertiser wants because of how they make you feel, unquote. And so you are kept in a perpetual state of childishness. He calls this junk politics.